Hello friends, welcome to my channel Sushant Chess Wise. Today we are going to look at the next practical Rook Endgame, that is the position number 2 of our practical Rook Endgame. We are going to discuss two topics. One is the rook behind the first pawn, and today we are going to see what is collective advance. So let's get started with the position. Here we see that there is a 2 versus 1 pawn scenario. White has 2 pawns against black's 1 pawn. So we are going to take the positions in such a way that gradually we will be increasing the number of pawns. And in today's case we have pawns on the opposite side, means both have got passed pawns. In the last example we saw it was 2 against 1 but on the same side. So this position is white to play, and white won the game using both these techniques. One, rook behind the passer, and second, he used the collective advance. So we will discuss how the player played in the game, what could have gone wrong. Let's get started with the position. White to play here. White wants to push his pawns at the earliest, and at the same time he has to ensure that the black b pawn doesn't become very dangerous. Black will try to promote his pawn and try to collect the white rook as early as possible, so that later on his king is able to go towards the white pawns. White can go wrong here in several ways. Suppose white starts with the move f5, trying to push the passed pawn immediately. Then we will see that black will get the move rook b8, very important move. After which we will see that the black pawn's advance is unstoppable, and if the white rook tries to come behind and defend the position, it will be a bit too late. Let's say, for example, now f6, then b3, f7, then b2, and we will make out that the black pawn would be in first. So white can try to bring his rook. So rook e7 or rook h7, these are possible. b3, rook e1, the rook is trying to defend, and soon white will be ready to push his pawns. Here black can do one of the two things: either play b2 instantly, force the rook to sit in front of the pawn, and rush his king towards the opponent's pawns. And now we see that the king is heading to e5 and then f6, and once the king settles in front of the pawn, the black rook will start giving checks. Here the white rook has come underneath the pawn, that is in front of the pawn, and hence white will not be able to convert this game. So white can try the move king f4, but here also after kd6, g4, king e7, the king is able to settle in front of the pawn, and now after the move g5, the black rook will start harassing with the checks. The king will not be able to go in front of the pawn, and now k e5, then again check, king e4, again check. As soon as the king approaches the pawn, rook again attacks the f5 and the g5 pawn, and the game will be drawn. Let's say white plays the move king g5, then black can either play king f7, and now again same situation, king h6 allows to give check when again the king goes to g5, and black plays rook b8 and repeats the position. So what we have seen here, the scenario has become totally different now. The rook which was active has become passive, and the opponent's king which was trying to push his own pawn has now become the defender. So the king's role as a defender is better, and the rook's role as an attacker is usually to be preferred. So this position is now drawn. Let's see what happened in the game. In the game, white played the right way. White first brought his rook behind the opponent's passed pawn. One of the biggest benefit of having the rook behind the passed pawn is we control through all the squares till the pawn is queening. So opponent has to either block this rook, or he has to force the queening of pawn and try to get that rook which is stopping the pawn from queening. So here now 3 different situations can arise. We will look at them. After the move b3, white goes f5. This is the right time to push the pawn. Here black can try 3 things. One, he can go for the move rook a4 in order to block the opponent's rook. After rook a4, but white here wins by a tempo, he can just play f6 when we see that after rook b4, kb4, f7, and the pawn becomes queen with a check. Okay, so the pawn will still be standing on the b2 square. So rook b4, kb4, f7, b2, and f8 queen check. And after the trade of queen for pawn also, white will manage to win with his g pawn. Although he is not forced to give up his queen for the pawn. We know the queen can win against the pawn on the 7th rank on its own as well. After the move rook a6 here, we will see that white can just play f7, keep the pawn protected, rook f6 check, kg4, and here we will note that even the trade of b pawn for f pawn will also allow white to get his rook and block the opponent's king, and the position will be similar to the previous position. So white will be able to manage a Lucena-like position. And after the move kc3, kg5, white attacks the rook moves away, g4, b2, kg6, and the king has managed to hold the pawn. After the move kc2, kg7, and g5 both win. g5, b1 queens, rook takes b1, king takes b1 because rook has to keep the f8 square guarded, kg7, kc2, f8 queen, rook f8, king f8, and we see that the white pawn will queen and white wins the game. So the technique of bringing the rook in middle as a bridge doesn't work here. Let's look at the other two methods now. The second approach could be to place the rook behind the pawn, that is rook should come from behind, and another approach is to keep the rook in front of the pawn and try to push our own pawn on the other side. Let's look at them one by one. After rook f8, usually rook coming underneath the pawn is not a good situation, and here white wins very easily, and here he uses the collective advance. By collective advance we mean that there are two pawns and a king which move step by step ahead and they improve their position. For example, now white will play the king to f4, pawn to g4, then pawn goes to g5, then another pawn moves to f6 or g6, and the king occupies the whole. And gradually all the three units, two pawns and the king, they keep on advancing. So let's have a look at that. King f4, kc3, g4, b2, g5, kc2, and now white will push one of the pawn, whichever. Here g6 is better because it is capable of attacking the f8 rook. Otherwise, even if we play f6 here, we will use this pawn now. If we play g6, we will use the g5 square for the king on the next move. If we play f6, then we will use the f5 square for the king. For example, b1 queen, rook takes b1, king takes b1. I did this just to show you pushing the g pawn was little better. Now after king f5, kc2, g6, kd3, g7, rook g8. Now many will think that white will play f7, rook g7 and f8. Well, that wins. But queen versus rook, there will be some fight. But white again uses the method of collective advance. He occupies the whole, protects the g7 pawn, and after any move like ke4 or kd4, pushes the pawn to f7. And now the rook can be given up only for one pawn, and the other pawn would queen. So after rook g7, kg7, next move f8 queens, and white wins the game. So having the rook underneath the pawn is usually the worst case. Let's look at the main variation now. After the move f5, black should play the move rook a1. This is his best attempt. The rook will try to attack the pawns from behind, and usually he tries to attack the pawn which is ahead. Then what happens? The one which is ahead, that is not able to move because it will be captured, and the neighboring pawn which protects it is also not able to move. Let's see how. Right now f6 is blunder because rook f1 check and the pawn would be taken. Even the move king e4 will be loss of move after the move re1 check, or even just rook f1. white should simply push his pawns and not waste any time. G4, black has to push his pawn. Giving check will only improve the king placing. For example, rook f1 check, ke4, rook e1 check, king f4, rook f1 check. Here the move king e5 is very good when the king will try to sit ahead of the pawn. Even the move king g5 is very good, another way to improve the pawns and make a collective advance. For example, check, ke4 check, king f4 check, kg5, and now after again kc3, f6, b2, kg6, kc2, g5. We see a similar situation when white will be able to queen his f pawn and later on the g pawn will win. So b1, rook b1, kb1, kg7, kc2, f7, kd3, f8 queen. And after rook f8, king f8, we reach exactly the same position which we were discussing before, when the rook was underneath the pawn and white wins the game. So giving the check is of no use. Black instead improves his position, plays kc3. He is all set to play b2 followed by b1 and try to take with the rook on b1 so that the king can go nearer to the opponent's pawns. Here white pushes the pawn to g5 immediately. He wants both his pawns on the 6th rank. We know there is a rule that when the two pawns reach the 6th rank, they are superior to the rook. Only condition is the opponent's king should be far away. And now b2. Well, g6 is quite simple and white will be able to win the game. After rook g1, king f4, kc2, king e5, b1 queen, rook takes b1, king takes b1. Taking with the rook would allow the pawn to advance even earlier. So this is the benefit of having the rook behind the pawn which is ahead. The pawn which is ahead cannot move because it will be taken, and the pawn behind also cannot be moved now because rook takes g6 and the rook is able to sacrifice itself for the pawn on f6. But white can play the move king f6, kc2, play his king to g7 and push the f pawn so that the black king cannot attack the f pawn in time. So after kd3, f6, ke4, f7, rook f1, f8 queen, rook f8, king f8, kf5, g7, and white wins the game. So white was just on time and he was able to convert the position into win. I hope you are finding these lessons useful. Do like, share and subscribe the channel. Thanks for your time.